Chapter 10. A Harsh Accusation. "There's one thing I'm glad of," declared Bess as the girls drove back toward New Holland. "We don't have to return to the Kreutzes and tell them that their daughter is taken up with a thief." "If Manda really is with the Holts," said Nancy quickly, "I'm sure that she's entirely unaware of what they're doing." George pointed out that, nevertheless, the Amish girl might have to testify in a court case if the Holts were apprehended. "That would just about crush her proud mother and father," she said. Presently, Nancy noticed that they were not far from the road which led to the Zinn house. She suggested that they stop there and tell Mr. Zinn what they had learned regarding the Holts. It was also possible that he might have additional news for them. "Besides," said Nancy, "he has no idea where we're staying now, in case he should want to get in touch with us." Turning the car into a side road, Nancy drove directly to the antique dealer's farm. In his office, the girls found the man wearing a broad smile. He greeted them happily, announcing jubilantly that business had been brisk and profitable. "I've sold many pieces of furniture since yesterday morning," he said, "and at good prices, too. Well, have you any news for me of the stolen antiques?" Before Nancy could reply, Mr. Zinn went on. "You remember that cherry table, the copy of the George Washington piece you were interested in?" As the girls nodded, he continued, "That was one of the articles I sold." He chuckled. "A couple came in here who were interested in buying it. I named a high price, expecting them to bargain me down, but they never said a word about the price and bought the table." Again, Nancy started to tell what she had heard about Mr. and Mrs. Holt possibly being in the neighborhood, but Mr. Zinn gave her no opportunity. He rambled on. "Funny thing about that couple. They're Amish, but they don't live around here. Came from Ohio. It's a long distance for them to drive in a carriage," he mused. Nancy, Bess, and George were astonished. "Was this man driving a black horse?" Nancy queried. "Yes," Mr. Zinn replied. "What made you ask that?" This time, he waited for Nancy to answer, and she told him of her suspicion that Holt was masquerading. "It's very likely he has found out the George Washington tables he stole don't contain the secret he's looking for," Nancy deduced. Mr. Zinn chuckled. "And because of the high price I set on my copy of the table," he said, "he figured it must be the genuine matching piece." "Exactly." Suddenly, Mr. Zinn's expression changed from one of elation to concern. "You mean I had the thief who stole my inheritance right in my shop and let him get away?" The antique dealer shouted, his face growing red with anger. "I'm afraid so," said Nancy. Then, on a sudden hunch, she asked, "How did this man pay for the table?" "In cash. Big bills," Mr. Zinn replied. "May I see them?" the young detective requested. The man unlocked his old-fashioned roll-top desk and took out a tin box. From this he removed 5 $20 bills. "Here's what the fellow gave me," he said. Nancy took a similar bill from her wallet and compared the other 20s on which President Jackson's face was printed. First, she compared the letter, plate, and serial numbers and the series identification with Mr. Zinn's money. All seemed to be in order. Next, she compared the paper quality, knowing that genuine United States currency has a distinctive feel. They were identical as far as she could tell. While the group watched breathlessly, Nancy examined the scroll work on the border of the face and backplates of each note. Now she frowned. In this respect, they were lacking in continuity and uniformity of shading. "Look!" she exclaimed, and pointed out the variance there was in the 5 $20 bills from her own, which was sharp and clear. Suddenly, Mr. Zinn cried out, "Those bills the man gave me is counterfeit gelt!" Yes, I'm pretty sure it is, Nancy agreed. The man was very upset. He paced back and forth in his office. Finally, Nancy asked him if he were not going to call the police and tell them about the counterfeit money. "Yeah, the dealer said. He fumbled through the telephone book looking for the number of the police station. Finally, he handed Nancy the book and asked her to do it. $100, he mumbled to himself. Even if I did overcharge him, that table was worth $50. Nancy found the number and made the call. Then she turned the instrument over to Mr. Zinn. The local police captain said that he would send a counterfeit expert down at once to examine the money. In a short time, 2 officers arrived. One immediately said the bills were fake. The other policeman wrote down a description of the couple who had bought the table. "We'll send out a message to the state troopers," one of the officers said. "We ought to pick up the 2 of them in no time." The girls stayed around to wait for a report. But as the hours passed, there was no news that the couple had been caught. Mrs. Zinn, more philosophical than her husband about the loss, did not let it bother her. At noontime, she served the girls a tremendous meal. A short while after they finished eating, George caught Bess secretly weighing herself on a scale in the barn. Peering over her cousin's shoulder, she exclaimed, "Bess Marvin! You've gained 5 pounds since you left home." Bess was embarrassed momentarily, but insisted that George also get on the scale. The girl with the tomboyish figure was aghast at the weight that she too had put on. "If this keeps up," she said, chuckling, "I'll have to go out in the fields and walk behind a horse-drawn plow for 2 solid hours to lose the extra pounds." Late in the afternoon, the girls were upstairs in the Zinn house. They were looking at several patchwork quilts which Mrs. Zinn had made with the help of her neighbors, when her husband rushed into the house. "Where's Nancy Drew?" he shouted, and from the tone of his voice, the girls knew that he was angry. "We must go down at once," Mrs. Zinn said. "Papa is upset." She and the visitors hurried to the kitchen, where Mr. Zinn stood with his feet far apart and his hands on his hips. He glared at Nancy. "So this is how you work," he cried. "You come around here pretending to be friends, and this is what you do to me." Nancy was nonplussed. She hardly knew what to reply, but she finally asked him what he meant. "As if you did not know," he said, shaking a finger at her. "But I have friends and you've been found out. You thought you could get away with those 2 valuable lamps of mine, but you didn't do it." The young detective stared in utter bewilderment. Had the man gone out of his mind? George, who had been growing angrier by the moment during the man's recital, demanded that he explain his accusations. "Those 2 lamps in your car!" Mr. Zinn roared. "How long have they been there? Did you take them yesterday or today? The woman told me you're a witch, and now I believe it." "Oh, Papa, do not say such things," his wife pleaded. It was several minutes before she could calm the man enough for him to give an explanation. A young woman had telephoned to warn him that a girl by the name of Nancy Drew from River Heights, who looked very innocent, was really a witch and a thief. She was riding around the countryside stealing small, valuable antiques. "The woman told me," said Zinn, "that if I looked in her car, I would no doubt find something from my shop. Well, I did. Nancy Drew, I'm going to call the police." End of chapter 10.